Hi, everyone, and welcome to Workflow Optimization, the next frontier in healthcare, a BPM Plus Health virtual event with sessions and demos that we had lined up for the HIMSS 20 conference. My name is Tracy Berardi, Program Manager of BPM Plus Health. This is our second session of the two-day virtual event. This session is titled A Shareable Clinical Pathway for Anemia Management. And speakers joining us include Denis Gagne from Trisotech and John Svirbely from Trisotech. In the chat box in the GoToWebinar toolbar, you'll see there's a link that contains our schedule of events for today and tomorrow. This is also at that link, it's where we will post the slides and the recorded videos. We'll have those up fully by the end of the week. So check back there for reference. There's also a questions tab in GoToWebinar. We'd love to take your questions, so feel free to enter them in the questions box as they come, and we'll adjust those towards the end. And if we run out of time, we'll take them over email. I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Denis to get started. Thanks, Denis.
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this little session here. I'm Denis Gagne from Trisotech, and I'm here with John.
Hi, John Svirbely.
So today we want to talk to you about a shareable clinical pathway for anemia management. This presentation was originally scheduled to be at the Innovation Theater at HIMSS. So we're going to do a version of this talk that is more adapted to the media that we have now with the web. So the goal is to present about shareable clinical pathways. So shareable clinical pathways are really a visual decision model that is both human readable and machine automatable. So the goal here is to have a single artifact that is used both for humans to consume and for the machine to consume. And these standardized workflows can improve efficiently and quality of healthcare processes very greatly by simplifying the interpretation from the human as well as from the machine. So in this particular presentation, we'll demonstrate such models using the diagnosis and management of anemia. So the objective of these automatable clinical guidelines is to use standards, open international standards, to disintegrate the guidelines themselves, both the creation and the interpretation of the guidelines. Guidelines are usually long narrative, sometimes hundreds of pages long, sometimes just a few pages long, but they leave to a lot of interpretation by the different readers. So the idea here is to create such models that are interpretable exactly the same by human and by machine. So it's a visual knowledge artifact creating for the clinician and for automation. Behind all this work, there's a community of practice called the BPM Plus Community of Practice. And this community of practice is really a regrouping of healthcare institutions, professional societies, and different software vendors to establish and foster the sharing and promotion of best practice around modeling and sharing either clinical pathways, clinical guidelines, or any other healthcare knowledge structure. Trisotech is a founding member of this community and a very active participant in this very thriving new community of practice. So a little bit of introduction to BPM Plus for those that are not aware about these open standards from the Object Management Group. The URL is at the bottom of the page there. So these standards are both machine interpretable, so we talk about models, and they're based on unambiguous graphical notation or visual language. So we have the model and notation moniker that comes from. So we have BPMN for business process model and notation. And BPMN is really to create process diagram or workflows and create these flow of diagrams or the structure of the guidelines. We then have CMMN for case management model annotation, which is there more to support the unstructured process where the knowledge worker, the subject matter expert, is more in control of what is happening, and things can evolve in a very unpredictable way. So for example, personalized patient care. Then we have a third component to the BPM Plus triad of language, DMN, which is the decision model annotation. And DMN offers the capability of modeling how decisions are made by specifying the required information for the decision and the logic for the decision to take place. One of the biggest tool of DMN, or one of the most used tool of DMN, is our decision tables. We're also using a mixture of different healthcare related standards or specific standards, in particular FHIR for data sharing, and CDS Hook, which is a service that can be invoked via an EHR or EMR through a webhook type of approach. And this is also combined with FHIR. So we're using both these standards in the context of this presentation and demo. So basically, this is a collection of open standards coordinated together to work together. So at the top, you have the EHR or the EMR system that via a CDS hook call with a patient ID will call the BPM Plus environment where the BPMN, CMMN, and DMN model will automate. And then in return, these model will query with the patient ID the FHIR data to get it back, and so that it can do its logic and compute its results, and then send it back to the EHR or EMR via what's called a CDS card. So that gives you a little bit of an overarching understanding of how things are integrated together. I'm now going to pass it on to John, who will talk about the anemia specific elements.
Hi, this is John Svirbely again. And the question is perhaps maybe why anemia? Well, anemia is something that's relevant to most clinicians. It's also challenging. Next week, the Royal Society of Medicine is having a seminar on anemia in the elderly and made the following observations. It's common, it's multifactorial, it's complex. It may be poorly assessed or investigated, and diagnosis and management often is non-standardized in its care. Next slide, please. Here's a hypothetical patient, a 57-year-old female who's postmenopausal, has an arthritis, mild decline in renal function, on multiple medications, no evidence of GI bleeding. She's got a hemoglobin of 9.1 grams per deciliter and an MCV, or mean cell volume, of 80 femtoliters. Normally, you'd expect a woman of this age to have a hemoglobin of 13. So her hemoglobin is much below that, so she has an anemia. The question is, what's the cause? We know she does not have active bleeding. There's pretty good evidence for that. But there are many, many causes of anemia, and you don't know when you start dealing with such a patient, is it something that is simple, something that can be resolved with just a few questions or tests, or is it something that requires an extensive workup and something that might even require bone marrow or additional studies? In the past, a clinician could take the time to work it up themselves or refer to a hematologist. And if you get the next slide, please. Unfortunately, today, clinicians are faced with more and more barriers to the practice of medicine. For one, there's a barrier, there's little time. There's restrictions on what you can order, what tests you can do, who you can refer things to. You may have people who do not have the money to afford an extensive workup. There's economic barriers. And finally, there's knowledge barriers. We've seen that knowledge increases very rapidly. And for many clinicians, they have an understanding of some basic forms of anemia, but not all the subtleties that may be out there. And all these factors make the availability of automation attractive. Next slide, please. And what are some problem areas in the diagnosis and management of anemia? First, there's nutritional issues. Diet and absorption of nutrients, such as celiac disease, can mean that essential elements, copper, iron, vitamin B12, are not absorbed and can't contribute. And these sometimes can be subtle. Anemia of chronic disease, which is systemic inflammatory disorders with high levels of cytokines that interfere with hematopoiesis, can be a problem. Drugs can interfere with hematopoiesis in multiple ways. They can be directly toxic to the bone marrow. They can cause autoimmunity. There's issues that have non-compliance. So drugs are a big factor, need to be considered. Hyperplastic bone marrow just means that the bone marrow, as you get older, just does not produce as well as when one is younger, and that's just a normal aging effect. That's in distinction to myelodysplasia, where the precursor cells in the bone marrow are dysplastic. They're disordered and malfunctioning. This can present in middle age and can be quite subtle initially, but eventually, as it progresses, it can lead to sideroblastic anemia and leukemia. And it can be a very devastating disorder. You have the non-cycling hemoglobinopathies. Hemoglobin has many inherited disorders that affect a large proportion of the world's population, and these can be challenging, especially if you're not from the communities where these are prevalent. And then finally, you have hormonal disorders such as hyper or hypothyroidism. Next slide, please. And in BPM Plus, we talk about processes, and in anemia, there's a process. We always start off establishing a diagnosis. Is the person anemic or not? If they are anemic, what are the causes? There are hundreds of causes of anemia. There's a few that are very common. There are some that are encountered with some frequency, but there's a very long list of items that are encountered infrequently or never in a clinician's life. And so a strategy is needed to start from the patient data and to get down to one or two final causes that are causing the anemia, and that can be treated. If treatment is started, then after a period of time, usually 2 to 3 weeks, patient is reassessed. If the diagnosis and therapy are appropriate, then the anemia should be improving. If not, there could be a misdiagnosis or a wrong diagnosis, or therapy may not be appropriate. And some troubleshooting is required to adjust therapy so that the appropriate care can be given, with the ultimate goal is that the patient is no longer anemic. Next slide, please. And so for HIMSS, what we wanted to do was come up with a very, very simple model that a clinician could see that would not overwhelm them with the technology. And so this is our initial model, which is the intake for a person with anemia, and consists of 2 decision modeling notation in the model. One is for the World Health Organization grading of anemia. The second is for an initial triage of anemia based upon the mean cell volume and the red cell distribution width. Off to the left, the patient comes into the system, and a clinical examination is performed where the clinician may look for signs and symptoms of anemia. Based on the clinical assessment, hemoglobin testing is performed. And then on the basis of age, sex, hemoglobin, and pregnancy status, if the person is female, the World Health Organization has a decision table that basically says the patient has anemia, and if anemia is present, then is it mild, moderate, or severe? So this model establishes the first step in the diagnostic process. If the person does not have anemia, they exit the system. If they do have anemia, then they go into the next step. The MCV, or mean cell volume, and RDW, red cell distribution width, are 2 indices that are readily available from the automated hematology analyzers that people use. And the premise is that different types of anemia have different impacts upon the size of red cells. Some anemias are characterized by a microcytic anemia, which means that the red cells are smaller than normal. Some anemias are feature a macrocytic or enlarged red cells, and some don't affect the red cell size at all. And so if you take the patient's MCV and compare it to the upper and lower limit of the MCV for the population, you can determine, is it small, normal, or large? The other measure, red cell distribution width, is a measure of how heterogeneous the red cell population is in size. So are the cells relatively uniform, or there's a wide variation in size? And so between these two, if we could have the next slide, Denny, we can reach decisions that can at least help us in the first step in the diagnostic pathway. In this model, we basically have oval items at the base, which are the data inputs. We have 3 data inputs relevant to the mean cell volume and 2 relative to the red cell distribution width. If you compare the MCV versus the limits of upper and lower, you can decide if it's lower than the lower limit of normal, it's microcytic. If it's higher than the upper limit, it's macrocytic. In between, it's normocytic. That gives us that answer for the MCV. For the RDW, it's simpler. If it's greater than the upper limit of normal, it's increased. If not, it's not increased. Both of these decisions are fed to a decision table. And the decision table in the next slide does an initial breakdown of possible causes. There are 6 buckets. If you are microcytic and have normal RDW, you might think of a beta thalassemia. If it's microcytic with an increased RDW, you might think of iron deficiency and a couple other disorders. And this is carried down all the way down. So this gives you at least a short list that you can do your next workup on. Next slide, please. Now, that first model takes us to a certain point, and it's necessary to go further on. So there are models for microcytic anemia, macrocytic anemia, and normocytic anemia. Plus, we have a model for interpretation of the peripheral blood smear. Between these 3, you usually can take a person to an extremely short list of conditions that probably the diagnosis exists. In this model for microcytic anemia, at the left, we have a decision that says, is this truly microcytic? If not, it exits and proceeds to either the macrocytic or normocytic model. If it is a microcytic, we have to consider what the differential diagnosis is. The top 4 causes are iron deficiency anemia, thalassemia, hemoglobinopathies other than thalassemia, then anemia of chronic disease. The boxes with little plus in it indicates that there is a subpros beneath this level, and where decisions are made. Is there evidence for iron deficiency anemia? Is there evidence for thalassemia? For hemoglobinopathies, that might involve doing hemoglobin electrophoresis. But each of these things are evaluated, and the decision comes back is stating, is it likely or has it been excluded? At the bottom is a miscellaneous causes, where there are 6 or 7 conditions that are less common, such as heavy metal poisoning, which are not usually considered initially. They're considered when the other conditions have been excluded. They also may be considered if there's something in the patient's history that triggers an evaluation for it. But if you have a person coming in with microcytic anemia, this allows you to consider the main items in the differential diagnosis, and then hopefully reach 1 or 2 factors at the end. One thing about diagnosis of anemia is that it can be problematic due to mixed disorders and to masking. In a mixed disorder, you have a person with multiple causes of anemia, such as a person with thalassemia who is now iron deficient, and that can be a challenge. The second is masking, where you have a condition causing a microcytic anemia like iron deficiency. At the same time, the person is vitamin B12 deficient, which causes a macrocytic condition. Those effects on the red cell size can make a normocytic picture. That results in masking. It's not, the causes are not obvious, but then the RDW is abnormal. And that's just something where one of the problems that has to be encountered in diagnosis. Next slide, please. And of course, once you reach a decision, you would need models to help guide therapy. And this one would be for an iron deficiency anemia, where the person comes in that's been established that iron deficiency is present. The first step is to say, well, if the person's deficient, just how deficient are they? And there's little calculators that decide based on the hemoglobin or the ferritin or amount of blood loss, just how much iron the person needs to have their iron stores restored. Once you determine what the goal is, you have to decide how it's going to be achieved. Iron can be replaced orally or by IV. Usually it's oral, but oral therapy can have problems. In high doses, it can cause GI upset. There may be malabsorption. The person may be on dialysis, or the patient may have excessive bleeding, all of which means that oral therapy may not be appropriate. But you have a little model that says, well, which route should I go? Once you decide at the branch point which approach is best, a protocol determines what the appropriate dose might be and how it should be given. And then therapy is given. At 2 to 3 weeks later, you then have a process where you look for the adequacy of the response. If the therapy is working and the patient is showing a positive response, you continue therapy until the person is cured. If not, you troubleshoot and find out what the problem is, and then hopefully modify therapy so again the patient can be cured. And next slide, please. Back to you, Denis.
Okay, thank you, John. So let me switch here to a little bit of a demonstration. So basically, starting from the initial model, so here we have the BPMN model for the initial assessment of anemia. And the model goes through the various steps, so we can actually follow the step where the provider can look at the steps step by step. So for example, the first step is clinical examination, and multimedia elements can be connected to this. So for example, here we just connected to the Wikipedia list of symptoms, and you can step through the model all the way to the logic. So this not only becomes the documentation of the logic, you can actually step through that logic step by step and see the results as you're going through. So the single artifact, the process model here, also becomes a multimedia scaffolding or training for the subject matter expert or for people to consume. It can also, the same artifact can also be used as the documentation. So out of this model, we can generate a report, and this report then becomes the narrative alternative for the guidelines, and will step you through the whole elements of the initial anemia assessment, each activity, each step, what they mean with augmented documentation, and you can also put all the details of the inputs, what type of inputs those are, and all these values are hyperlinked within the document. So it becomes a multi-hyperlinked document that has all the definition of all the different inputs and all the different decision and tasks, and what inputs are required for each task and what output is generated. And at the end, you even have the specific details of what are the possible outputs of non-mild, moderate, or severe. So the same single artifact, which is this BPM model, in here the BPMN model out of the BPM Plus collection of model, is used as a single artifact. So that means that you only have one artifact to manage the life cycle, to improve it, to make changes, to correct it. And that way, by side effect, you get the multimedia version, you get the documentation, and also very interestingly to us here is you also get the automation, because this visual rendering is precise in its semantic for execution, that the machine can actually read this diagram and execute this diagram using a BPMN engine or DMN engine, CMMN engine. that can read those diagrams and literally execute the diagram.
And it's also shareable.
And it's shareable, and that's being an open source standard, an open international standard, it also open source, can be shared from vendor to vendor or application to application. So this is the BPMN. The same is true about the decision model. So as John was talking about, for example, here's the World Health Organization decision model, which requires as an input the age in years, the sex status, and the hemoglobin, and then has its logic description defined with a decision table that basically leads to the various conclusions. And as you execute this decision, so, and let's say I put a 25-year-old non-pregnant female with an hemoglobin of, John, lead me.
9.1.
9.1. Then we can see that this person would have moderate anemia according to WHO, and we can go and look at exactly which rule fired to lead to that conclusion. And this rule here that fired is the explanation of why the conclusion is moderate. And where does this data come from? It comes from evidence-based care that was provided through the World Health Organization data. So this is providing us not only with complete explanation of how things get done and why things gets done, but it also is based on referenceable evidence. Now, what we have here is an emulator of an EHR or EMR. So basically here, I have different patients that are listed here on the right. And here I have the quote unquote CDS hook card that would be returned. Right now, this service is, this system is not using any services. So what we're able to do with these standards is we're able to create a library of microservices that can be containerized. So we're really into the modern architecture of containerized microservices. So each of these models, the anemia assessment here, the anemia severity, are turned into microservices, and these microservices are available in a library. So we have a library here of these decision or knowledge services, decision process services. We have over 800 of these decision services or knowledge services available here in the various language of BPM Plus. And then I can go and look, for example, for the anemia service, and I'll look at the BPMN specific model. And here I have a Fire-based version of this service. So now I can go, and for the more technically inclined people, I can go and select this service endpoint. And into my application, I can just add this service as a new endpoint and save it. And now the CDS hook connected. So now my EHR, through that standard, can go and query that service. So as I pick a patient in my list here, and I change patient, I'm presently on Andrew Price, and I can see that Andrew Price has no anemia signs. But I can also change patient and select Cynthia Wilson here. And when I do, I can see that for Cynthia Wilson, she has a moderate anemia severity, and she's got these potential type of anemia. So we've done automatically all these steps here into this model. So we took the data, we did the grade, the classification of grade. Then once we had the grade, we did a further classification or categorization. So we had a limited list to be treated. And that's what's happening here automatically on this. And I can go on changing different patient in my EHR. And if I go to Nancy Ross here and I run for her, you see that she's also moderate, but here I have a much larger set of potential type of anemia that I need to then discriminate between. And then on the patient here, I can actually go and look at this patient and look at the patient and see the different elements and the different observations. So here there are 3 different observations that are used in this particular context. So this is not meant to be an actual EHR to be used by anybody, but this is a sandbox to showcase how any EHR with the webhook service and adding the service to it can then run through and get me an information card with all the details. So again, one single artifact, which is a visual rendering of the process, the steps and decision regarding anemia, is at the same time my narrative documentation that I have here. It is also my multimedia documentation that I can animate through. And it is also the service that can be consumed. So this can be exposed as a microservice, containerized microservice. And by that, that means that I have a very scalable infrastructure or architecture where we can run thousands of these in parallel. Now, interestingly, all these services that are running, I can also look at them and in an anonymized way get the results. So for example, from, sorry, wrong tile. So from here, I can connect to this environment. And now when I'm running on a patient, so here, if I remove this patient and move to, let's say, Lisa Robinson, and I run this, I get the results here, as you would expect from the card, but in the background, the execution collects exactly what information was provided to start the service. So here I have the fire structure of what was sent to the service, and then I have the result, the CDS hook card return that is provided. So as this service is used over and over and over, this gets tallied in here, and so we have a log of all these calls to this microservice. That means that now, from an evidence point of view, we're starting to have very specific data about which type of anemia is most seen, how it is discriminated, categorized, and what we get. So we have very, very strong evidence to continue. So this is a continuous virtuous type of loop, feedback loop, where we can improve the models as we go forward. So I think we're going to move on to questions now. So Tracy, back to you. Okay, so the first question that we have is, why do current EHRs not offer this type of decision support? Is there any lag in entering the data in the clinical application and the trigger of the decision support at the point of care? So the first portion, why do EHR not offer this type of decision support? In fact, this movement is fairly new. So the BPM Plus community has been actively working for 3 years, but only in the last year has it become a formal entity promoting this. So we figured there's going to be a lot more of this available. But the standards that we're using here, the CDS hook and fire, are standards that are growing and growing more and more in the various EHR. In fact, many of the currently available EHR support CDS hook and fire or support their own API. So the beauty of what we presented here is that these decision services can be consumed from any application anywhere. It's just an API call. So we can connect to any API of any EHR. So we figured this is going to be coming more and more as we're preparing more and more of these models. We now have a library of about 800 to 900 models that we continuously grow and improve. Now, is there a lag in entering the data in the clinical application and the trigger to the decision other than the latency of the infrastructure that you use? No. So if you're right within your environment, this is instantaneous. And even if you're across, you know, the 5G network of the future, this is going to be very instantaneous. So even though this is a cloud distributable environment, you get this instantaneous results. As I was demoing with my little demo here, whenever I change patient, the results was coming in right away. So as I switch patient, I get the card updated instantaneously. Now, let me see if there are other questions.
Denis, it's Tracy. Sorry, I had a connection issue, but there is another question in the queue. What is the strategy for connecting the EMR data to the data needed by models? Basically connecting the dots?
Yeah, so fundamentally, this is part of the modern architecture of microservices. So all these services here are available as API services. So there's different endpoints that we provide here. There's an HTML form that is generated on the fly. There's a REST API. There's also an open API, which is a standard about API. And there's the CDS hook discovery. So all these API, all these services can be queried from any application. You can create your own web page that would query these services. And it's the responsibility of the calling application to do that data interconnection. So that way, whatever source you're starting from, you know what service you have, and the tool, so for example, if I go here, you see the tool knows the type and knows the structure. So the service itself is fully documented. So if I open the Open API file, so the API is self-documented. So Swagger is the Open API standard, and it tells you exactly what is expected from the service and the type and the structure of all the data inputs. So basically, any calling application can do its mapping to query that service with the proper data. Hopefully that completely addressed your question. Any other question, Tracy?
Comment from Ken. Back to your point that we might want to mention the BPM plus Health adoption group, and specifically you know, how this group looks at how to bring these capabilities into health organizations, including legacy systems, interactions, and data sources.
Yes, that's a very good point. So the BPM plus Health community has different subgroups that address different aspects of the usage of these standards. We have an adoption group, and that's the group that Ken is mentioning here, where they're dealing exactly with that notion on how different legacy environment can adopt these standards and these approach and make them localized to their reality. There's also a group that is working on authoring and how to author these models in the most effective and efficient way for subject matter experts. We also have a group that focuses on the technology and more of the implementation of this and how different vendors can work at implementing these so that we have a truly interchangeable, shareable standard around the world.
Yeah, and I'll add just for everyone on the line, if you're new to BPM Plus Health and you're interested in getting involved in one of our 5 different working groups, you can visit our website. It's bpm-plus.org. Also, there's a link in the chat box, a link to this virtual event page on our site. But you'll also see in the top, nav bar, there's 2 tabs for membership and also working groups. So you're very welcome to join our efforts. We have some really great people working on this. And Denis and John, we got another question. Are there technology enabling platforms that should be considered for future development, like distributed ledgers?
Yeah, of course. As everything progressed, the technology around everything is also progressing. So certainly the notion of distributed ledger and putting the data into a more non-restricted or more non-temporal, being proof of any kind of changes or interaction like blockchain, and these are technology that can be used. The data source, these services are defined independent of the data source. So whether your data source is within a distributed ledger, or it's in a database, or it's within an EMR or EHR, these services are not really specific to that platform. So the calling service or the calling to the service is really has the responsibility of doing that mapping. And there was another question about whether there are EMR or EHR that are currently attempting to implement these models. In fact, there are quite many. Many of the main EHR and EMR systems have some version of the notion of workflow and decision making. Some of them are using these standards, and we perceive that more and more of these different vendors will adopt open standards as the preferred way of implementing these, because they can benefit from all these models that are getting created by different knowledgeable sources like Mayo Clinic or Intermountain or many other organizations that are actively participating now in creating such model. We also have many professional society that are working at creating model, namely ACOG, the College of Gynecologists, and also ACEP, the College of Emergency Practitioner. So more and more of these models will become and are becoming available, which will become a big enticement for software vendors to integrate these norms and standards.
And that's the authoring work group for those interested that are authoring these guidelines. And I'll add, Denis is hopping on again at the top of the hour, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, for our next session on Patient Health Questionnaire 9, PHQ 9, automatable guidelines. So if you'd like to dig deeper into this subject, just hop back on in another 15 minutes. And it looks like we got through all the questions. Thank you, Denis and John.
Thank you,
great.
Tracy.
And yeah, absolutely. And thanks for everybody that tuned in. Again, we're capturing these presentations and posting them to the link that you see in the chat box. So we'll get those up soon. Any questions, feel free to contact us, and we'll see you again. Have a good rest of the day.